Now back on my rule flow, let's say I want to start to test these actual use cases with some test data like I mentioned. Again, Corticon's not limited to just hoping that we check and identify potential issues later on at runtime, nor those click of a button checks either. We have a whole host of testing capabilities for regression testing as we start to develop and maintain our rules over time. So I'm going to switch over to what's called a rule test. In this case, I've named the rule test file a rule test. But we can tell the rule test by that ERT extension. And I can always create a new rule test and have any number of them by going to File, New Rule Test, just as I did with all the other rule files along the way here. Similar with a rule vocabulary, I can create the same input and output structure based upon a imported JSON document if I have predefined structures of what the input payload and the expected output payload will look like. That's pretty valuable because I can not just have those saved and on hand as I make changes over time, but I don't need to have multiple different test cases be redefined as I go on. I can see how they behaved at one particular point in time and just reload given test cases and see how that behavior might have changed when I change the rules. The way to look at this rule test is relatively similar if you're familiar with API testing tools like Insomnia or Postman, where we have an input. Now, under the covers, this is similar to the input being formatted as a JSON payload in one of those API testing tools. But we're using the same notion of the rule vocabulary structure, not having to deal with any of the JSON formatting or anything like that. So I've dragged in this quote, and within each attribute, I could just double click and assign various different field values for the attributes that are applicable on the input payload. You see that I have this predefined test case already created, but I can have any number of these fields predefined, or I might delete some of the ones that I know are going to be populated at runtime. For this street address, for example, I just double click and enter in that string of text, whereas for, say, a Boolean attribute like add electronics, it'll by default have that drop down of just true or false, just as for the enumerated data types like the base coverage data type that we covered, it'll have a drop down for only those potential options as well. Now we can run this rule test not just against the rule flow. In this case, the rule flow that I keep referring back to is called homeowners.erf, but I can test against a specific rule sheet within the context of this rule flow. I can also test against, say, a rule flow, but with particular aspects of it disabled. That's pretty useful, and I use this often if I do introduce some sort of issue along the way and I want to isolate where exactly I have created some sort of issue. I can disable various different aspects, or just about any aspect of the rules that I create here, to test against the rules in absence of potentially problematic files or rules within a rule sheet. Everything can be disabled without disabling surrounding context. For example, just disable this, or even just disable Arizona, for example. Now I'm testing against that whole rule flow, and so now that I have this payload defined, I have two different buttons up here, well, a few different buttons. First one, deploy, is merely going to create the decision service against which I would be running this rule test. So this is basically transpiling the rules into a local version of that JavaScript and testing against, or be prepared to test against it without actually executing that rule test. The next button over is just run test, which will do everything I just described, but also invoke that newly generated JavaScript decision service. Let's start with that, and we'll see how what I get back in the output is all of the new or changed data in bold, as well as I see I have newly created entities such as this new coverage for flood, new coverage for electronics, and so on. That dynamically populated rule message that I covered from those curly braces being replaced with the actual state of Alabama and the premium of $2,896. But as we start to develop bigger and bigger and more complex projects, it's that much more useful and important to be able to isolate where specifically an aspect of the payload changed, when it happened, and have better analysis available to us of how these decisions are being made, on what bases, and particular which specific rules are potentially changing things more often or less often over time. So with this run rule test with rule trace, that's going to allow me to not just have this rule message output, but also beyond just what I, as the rule modeler, might have defined as a rule message, be able to see, irrespective of that, how that actual payload has changed as it goes through the course of that rule flow. So when I hit run test with rule trace, I'm going to get the same output payload, but I can be much more, I get a lot more information about every which way that payload changed as it went through that rule flow from start to finish. From the left to the right here, I have the sequence of events, what happened first to last, what specifically the decision service did at that particular stage in the sequence, the element upon which it did that, if it was any value previously, in this case all of the values were initially null, and the value that it created under the new value pane. Association entity, in the case when I am creating new entities, such as in the case of those new coverages that have been created, and where specifically in the course of this rules execution of the decision service that particular aspect of the output payload was impacted. So I see here, this is the name of the rule sheet and the rule within that rule sheet that produced that actual output. Now, if anything looks funky to me, such as maybe this doesn't look quite right, I click on that particular coverage and see that's where it was produced, and maybe I want to double click and go to that particular rule within this rule sheet to see where specifically that output was created, and maybe do some testing against that particular aspect to troubleshoot where specifically something might have been different than what I expected.